Welcome to Crimson Clues, the home of thrilling mysteries and shocking twists. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the so you never miss a clue. Now, let's start the mystery. The Secret of Lady Bantry's Bookshop, Chapter 1. Opening Day at Lady Bantry's Old Bookshop. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobbled courtyard of Gossington Hall, as Lady Bantry observed her latest venture with the contented air of a general reviewing victorious troops. The old carriage building, which had been unoccupied for nearly 2 decades, now shone with fresh whitewash and a clever new sign reading Bantry's old books in elegant gold letters. "Well, Arthur," she stated to her husband, who was watching the proceedings with the resigned smile of a man who had become accustomed to his wife's enthusiasms, "I think we've done rather well. The roof fund will benefit greatly, and we are giving a service to the community." Colonel Bantry, a robust gentleman with a military demeanor softened by years of comfortable retirement, nodded appreciatively at the sturdy oak shelves he'd ordered from a local carpenter. Solid work. The shelves should last at least another century. The turnaround was very astounding. What had previously housed carriages and harnesses was now lined with books, their leather spines forming a warm tapestry of browns, greens, and rich reds. The perfume of ancient paper and binding glue blended well with the lingering aroma of beeswax polish. Miss Jane Marple, who arrived on time at 9 a.m. for the ribbon-cutting event, stopped in the doorway to take in the scene, her piercing blue eyes took in every aspect with the thoroughness of someone who had learned from long experience that even the most innocent gatherings can hold the most astounding secrets. "How perfectly charming, Dolly," she muttered, recalling Lady Bantry's familiar name. Books, like people, frequently conceal their actual value beneath ordinary cloth. "Jane, my sweetheart." Lady Bantry hurried forward, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "You must meet our small team of volunteers. They have been very beneficial." The first introduction was to Hugo Drake, a gentleman of about 45 years old whose London tailoring and confident demeanor quickly distinguished him as a man of the world. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his hands, Miss Marple observed, were those of someone who was used to handling costly goods with caution. "Mr. Drake has been most generous with his expertise," Lady Bantry explained. "He's driven down from London just to help us appraise the shares. Some of these offerings are quite outstanding." Drake's smile was rehearsed and endearing. "Miss Marple, you unearthed the most astonishing gems in the most unexpected locations. Country estates like Gossington frequently contain literary treasures that have been forgotten for years." Miss Marple responded, "How fascinating, albeit something about the man struck her as rather theatrical. And how fortunate the charity is to have you be so generous with your time." Miss Clarissa Oswald, the local librarian, was the next volunteer, and her quiet manner and ink-stained fingers suggested a life dedicated to literature. She was a tiny, angular, middle-aged woman with steel-rimmed spectacles and an air of tense efficiency. "Miss Oswald has been cataloging our collection," Lady Bantry explained. Miss Oswald said, barely above a whisper, "It's been a pleasure to work so meticulously, with each volume properly recorded and classified. Some of these books have not been properly catalogued in decades. The history they contain is pretty impressive." Mr. Basil Trent, the town historian, stood out from the crowd, his austere figure hunched over a little leather-bound book. He was a guy of scholarly appearance, with prematurely white hair and the concentrated stare of someone used to long hours of research. His attire, while decent, demonstrated the academic's long-standing disregard for fashion trends. "Mr. Trent is particularly interested in our historical collection," Lady Bantry added, pulling him into the discourse. "He's been searching for some rather obscure pamphlets on local history." Trent looked up from his book, his pale eyes full of intellectual interest. "Lady Bantry, the material from the 17th century is particularly intriguing. There are references to records that would be extremely useful for my research into the Kentish uprisings of 1630. Miss Oda Pettigrew, a spinster lady of undetermined age, was the group's final member, and her careful handling of a Morocco-bound volume revealed her fondness for first editions. She was a petite, bird-like woman with sharp features and a look of restrained enthusiasm. Lady Bantry stated that Miss Pettigrew has been quite helpful in locating the most precious artifacts. Her knowledge of first editions is pretty extensive. Miss Pettigrew responded, her voice full of pride. The difference between a genuine first edition and a later printing might be significant, both historically and financially. As the small ceremony began, Miss Marple found herself observing the collected group with the same care she would give to a particularly intriguing piece of needlework. The venue was gorgeous, the cause worthwhile, and the participants all appeared to be dedicated to the same goal of raising funds for the church roof. However, something about the mood struck her as slightly off, like a single faulty note in an otherwise lovely tune. Hugo Drake, in particular, appeared to be paying much closer attention to the stock than one might anticipate from a volunteer, simply volunteering his knowledge. His gaze was continuously drawn to the shelves, and when he wasn't talking, his fingers drummed frantically against his thigh. Lady Bantry, dressed in her finest tweeds, walked forward with the ceremonial scissors. "I pronounce Bantry's old books officially open for business," she announced, tearing through the ribbons that hung over the entryway. "Let us raise enough to keep the rain out of St. Mary's for another century." The small crowd cheered respectfully, and people began to browse the collection. Miss Marple lingered, observing the volunteers' interactions and noting which volumes seemed to attract the greatest interest. Hugo Drake's reaction to a modest-looking volume in the poetry area stood out to her. His casual inspection of the book got more focused, and she noticed his face blanch slightly when he opened it. Whatever he saw there seemed to disturb him greatly, as he hastily glanced around the room before putting the volume into his jacket pocket. She heard him murmur to himself, but she was confident he was unconscious of her presence. The morning went well enough, with a constant stream of guests and many hopeful deals. Miss Marple, on the other hand, became increasingly conscious of tensions between the small group of volunteers, which she felt were not quite right in this attractive atmosphere of literary generosity. As she prepared to depart, she made a mental note to return shortly. Experience had taught her that if the fabric of a community's component revealed even the slightest tear, it was best to pay attention before that tear grew into something far larger and harmful. The afternoon sun was now casting distinct shadows, and Miss Marple believed that secrets were beginning to emerge. Chapter 2. A Collector with Unique Qualities. The afternoon sun slanted through the mullioned windows of the converted carriage house, creating geometric patterns on Bantry's well-organized shelves of antique books. The morning's opening ceremony had been deemed a smashing success, with many volumes already sold and a promising list of possible donors assembled. Lady Bantry, still glowing with the joy of a successful venture, was discussing the afternoon's plans with Miss Oswald when Hugo Drake's voice broke through the pleasant hum of conversation. "Lady Bantry, may I have a word?" Miss Marple, who had returned after lunch to examine the collection more completely, looked up from her inspection of a delightful small volume of Victorian poetry when she heard him speak. Bantry Drake's confident demeanor during the morning ceremony had given way to something approaching agitation. "Of course, Mr. Drake," Lady Bantry answered, her eyebrows raised slightly at his changed tone. "Is something amiss?" Drake's normally steady hands showed a little trembling as he took a leather-bound volume from his jacket pocket. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as the book he had been studying so intently earlier in the day. "This volume," he said, his voice bearing an odd note of doubt, "is Tennyson's first edition. I've examined it more closely, and I'm afraid there's something wrong with it." Lady Bantry approached, her countenance ranging from mild interest to concern. Not nearly correct. What way? Drake continued, his professional demeanor regaining some traction. The Morocco leather appears to be genuine, but the tooling on the spine and gilt lettering indicate modern work. He paused and ran his finger along the book's spine. The gilt has almost a new aspect to it, as if it were applied in the last few months rather than decades. Miss Oswald, who had been listening with growing concern, stepped forward, but surely this could only mean that the book had been recently rebound. Many collectors have had their treasures restored. Drake concurred, but his tone indicated that he found this answer insufficient. But there are other clues. While the paper is of decent quality, it lacks the distinguishing traits of an 1850 printing. The typography also felt slightly wrong. Lady Bantry's expression had become exceedingly serious. "Are you arguing, Mr. Drake, that this book isn't what it claims to be?" "I'm arguing, Drake, that it demands a far more thorough investigation than I can do here. With your permission, I'd want to take it back to London, where I have access to the necessary equipment and reference materials." Lady Bantry's countenance changed from concern to something resembling wrath. "Take it to London? But Mr. Drake, this volume is planned for a charity auction next week. It's one of our most precious deals, estimated to earn at least $300 for the roof fund, which is why its authenticity must be proven without doubt." Drake countered with a slightly patronizing tone, which Miss Marple observed caused Lady Bantry's chin to lift dangerously. "If there are any suspicions about its origins, the controversy might harm not only one specific sale, but the entire company's reputation. Enterprise reputation." Lady Bantry's voice had taken on a chilly sound that those who knew her well saw as a warning sign. "Mr. Drake, I'm beginning to wonder whether your fears aren't a little premature. Mrs. Wetherbe donated the book in memory of her late husband, a well-known collector. Its provenance is immaculate." Drake's jaws constricted. "With all due respect, Lady Bantry, provenance and authenticity are not always synonymous. Even the most prestigious collections can contain forgeries, especially when the items in question are expensive enough to make deception worthwhile." The exchange could have escalated further, but Miss Marple picked that time to approach the small group with a benign inquiry. "I hope I am not intruding," she said quietly, "but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. The verification of antique books is a fascinating subject, and I guess it is similar to detective work." Drake looked to her, clearly relieved by the interruption. "Miss Marple, your comparison is more appropriate than you may know. Forgery detection techniques have advanced significantly, ranging from paper analysis to ink dating." "How extraordinary," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes locked on Drake's hands as he indicated. "And I imagine such work involves specific materials, adhesives and such." "Indeed," Drake responded, apparently oblivious of the nature of her inquiry. "Modern binding techniques can be fairly convincing, yet they frequently leave traces that a trained eye can spot." Miss Marple nodded attentively, noticing the tiny white dust that appeared to cling to Drake's fingers. It wasn't the dust from old books, which was gray and slightly greasy, but something much fresher and more powdery, similar to the binding paste she'd seen the local bookbinder use when she took her own prayer book in for repair. "Mr. Drake," Lady Bantry replied, her voice bearing a note of finality, "while I value your knowledge, I must demand that the Tennyson volume remain here. The auction catalog has already been printed, and we have promises from our bidders. If you have serious questions about its legitimacy, I recommend that you document them adequately. But the book remains on display." Drake's controlled demeanor cracked for a brief period, exposing something approaching desperation. "Lady Bantry, I fear you don't comprehend the implications. If this book is a forgery and is discovered after the sale, the legal repercussions could be severe, with the purchaser facing prosecution and the charity's reputation irrevocably harmed." "Then perhaps," Lady Bantry responded with chilly composure, You should have conducted a more thorough initial examination. The book remains here, Mr. Drake, and that is definitive." Drake's cheeks reddened, and Miss Marple wondered if he would continue his dispute. Instead, he carefully replaced the volume to its proper place on the shelf, his movements tinged with suppressed wrath. "Very well," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "but I want it noted that I advised against proceeding with the sale without proper authentication." "Your objection has been noted," Lady Bantry said crisply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." Miss Marple lingered near the poetry area, allegedly examining a book of Dudsworth, but in reality observing Drake's actions. The man's excitement seemed extremely out of proportion to the situation, and she found herself wondering what had caused his sudden concern about the book's legitimacy. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Basil Trent, who approached the poetry shelves with the deliberate stride of a missionary. "Miss Marple," he continued, smiling respectfully, "I hope you find some treasures among the collection." "Indeed," she said, seeing that his gaze was locked on the identical portion. That had piqued Drake's interest. "The poetry collection is really good. Tennyson's first edition, for example, appears to be fairly extraordinary." Trent's pale eyes brightened with interest. "I observed the In Memoriam earlier." "Of course," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Lady Bantry mentioned your studies into local uprisings." "The Kentish uprisings of 1630, Trent agreed, his scholarly zeal visible. "There are certain contemporary stories that have been lost to history, but I have reason to suspect that copies might still exist in private collections. Sometimes the most precious historical papers are uncovered in the most unexpected places." As he spoke, Miss Marple noticed that his gaze kept returning to the Tennyson volume, and she wondered if his interest in the poetry section was as casual as he claimed. The afternoon passed on with a continuous trickle of guests and the cheerful bustle of a thriving venture, but Miss Marple found herself increasingly conscious of the undercurrents of strain that seemed to flow beneath the surface of the charming setting. Hugo Drake's behavior had been unusual, and she had noticed that his fingers had been powdered with what appeared to be new binding paste. As closing time came, she decided to return the next morning. Something about the day's events triggered her well-developed feeling of discomfort. An experience had taught her that when that instinct was triggered, it was best to pay heed. The darkness lengthened as she returned to her cottage, but she found herself thinking not of the lovely afternoon of intellectual browsing, but of Hugo. Drake's peculiar intensity and the odd coincidence of binding paste on his fingers in a shop where no such materials had been used that day. Chapter 3. Shelves That Should Not Have Fallen. Lady Bantry turned the key in the lock of the old carriage house, bringing the first taste of autumn's chill into the evening air. First day of selling her old books had exceeded her most hopeful hopes, with several valuable sales already recorded and a growing list of eager collectors who had promised to return for the next auction. "Quite a successful venture, I should say," she murmured to herself as she adjusted her handbag and prepared to return to the main house. The familiar comfort of Gossington Hall's drawing room, complete with well-worn chairs and the promise of a pre-dinner cherry, beckoned. She had gone about a dozen steps across the cobbled courtyard when she heard the disturbance. It was a massive smash followed by what sounded like a human cry, muted but definitely distressed. Lady Bantry froze, reflexively holding her handbag even tighter. The sound came definitely from the direction of the bookshop, although she had just shut the door herself, and everyone, to the best of her knowledge, had left some time before. "Arthur," she called toward the main house, but her voice seemed to be drowned out by the oncoming dusk, and she understood that her husband was most likely in his study with the door closed, reading up on the day's newspapers. She pondered for a time. The sensible line of action would be to summon Arthur or to call Inspector Slack instantly. But Lady Bantry had not survived 2 world wars and innumerable family problems by being easily intimidated. and the prospect of someone in agony overpowered her innate prudence. She dashed back to the carriage house, her keys jingling in her hurry. As she struggled with the lock, she heard movement from within and what sounded like someone calling for assistance in a voice she thought she recognized. She cried out, "Hello," as she pushed open the door. "Is anyone there? Are you doing all right?" The shop's interior was dim, lit mainly by fading daylight that filtered through the windows. At first look, everything appeared normal, but as her eyes adjusted to the low light, she noticed a figure wandering near the poetic alcove. "Thank God, Lady Bantry." The voice belonged to Miss Clarissa Oswald, the town librarian, who emerged from the shadows, looking distinctly disheveled. Her usually immaculate hair had lost its pins, and her skirt was covered in what appeared to be dust and trash. "Miss Oswald, what are you doing here? I assumed everyone had left hours ago." "I'd returned to get something I'd forgotten," Miss Oswald said, her voice quivering slightly. "My reading glasses, actually. I'd left them at the catalog desk, knowing I'd need them for the evening's job. But obviously you would have requested the key." Miss Oswald's face reddened in the dim lighting. "I'm afraid I felt embarrassed over my recklessness. I saw one of the windows was slightly ajar, so I took the opportunity of letting myself in. I hope you will excuse my presumption." Lady Bantry was ready to speak when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Beyond Miss Oswald in the poetry alcove, she noticed what appeared to be a significant disturbance. One of the tall bookshelves had fallen over, spilling its contents on the floor in a jumble of leather and paper. "Good heavens," she exclaimed, pushing past Miss Oswald to investigate the scene more closely. "What on earth has happened here?" It was then that she noticed him. Hugo Drake lay pinned behind the massive oak bookcase, face pallid and eyes closed. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, and something about his stillness made Lady Bantry feel uneasy. "Mr. Drake," she exclaimed, diving to her knees near the collapsed bookshelf. "Miss Oswald, help me lift this at once." But even as she spoke, she recognized that their combined power would be insufficient to move the large piece of furniture. The bookcase was one of the most sturdy that Colonel Bantry had commissioned, constructed to last generations and stocked with hefty books. Miss Oswald remarked, panicked, "I'll call for help. Dr. Haddock and possibly Inspector Slack, yes." Immediately, Lady Bantry agreed, though she was already concerned that help would arrive too late. Drake's face had an unsettling pallor, and she saw no indication of respiration. While Miss Oswald dashed to the phone, Lady Bantry knelt beside the trapped man, her thoughts racing. What may have caused such a large piece of furniture to topple? The bookcase had been securely fastened to the wall, and she had personally overseen its installation to assure stability. Her study of the situation was cut short when Dr. Haddock arrived, having answered to Miss Oswald's panicked phone call with impressive quickness. The old doctor took one glance at the situation and instantly started directing attempts to release Drake from beneath the bookcase. "We will need extra hands," he remarked solemnly. "Miss Oswald, could you please fetch Colonel Bantry and some of the men from the village?" Within minutes, the carriage house was full of willing laborers. Colonel Bantry arrived with 2 of his groundsmen, and numerous neighbors alerted to the ruckus joined the attempt. They managed to lift the hefty bookshelf and carefully remove Drake's still body. Dr. Haddock's examination was quick but comprehensive. After a few anxious moments, he looked up with a somber gaze. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said quietly. "Mr. Drake is dead." A startled silence swept over the assembled crowd. Lady Bantry felt blood drain from her face, and Miss Oswald let out a little cry of sorrow. "But surely," Lady Bantry murmured softly, "it was an accident. The bookcase must have been unstable." Dr. Haddock examined Drake's head with the care of a man who had witnessed many unexpected deaths. "I'm afraid it's not that straightforward, Lady Bantry. While the bookshelf did add to his injuries, there's evidence of temple trauma that occurred prior to the fall." Before the fall, Colonel Bantry took a step forward, his military attitude expressing itself in the face of adversity. "What exactly are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm proposing," Dr. Haddock said calmly, "that Mr. Drake may have been struck by anything before the bookshelf fell on him. There is a sharp localized trauma that does not fit with being crushed by falling furniture." Lady Bantry's gaze surveyed the scene, noticing the scattered volumes and clear indications of struggle. Near the base of the collapsed bookcase, she discovered a ladder that appeared to have been pushed over in the turmoil. "The ladder," she said, indicating the piece of equipment. "We use it to reach higher shelves, but what would it be doing in the poetry alcove?" Dr. Haydock approached to inspect the ladder more attentively. "Interesting," he said, running his finger along one of the rungs. "There's some sort of sticky stuff here, similar to paste or adhesive." The consequences of this finding hung over the gathering like a heavy cloud. If Drake had been struck before the bookshelf collapsed, and if there were traces of paste on the ladder, what had appeared to be a terrible accident was turning out to be something much darker. "I think," Colonel Bantry responded in the tone of a man accustomed to taking charge in tough situations, "we had better call Inspector Slack right away. This scene must be retained just as it is." Inspector Slack appeared within minutes, almost as if summoned by his remarks. His customary brisk demeanor was tempered by the gravity of the occasion. He took one look at the scene and instantly started issuing orders. "Nobody else enters this room," he declared. "This is now a crime scene, and it will remain sealed until we can conduct a proper investigation." Miss Oswald, who had been standing silently in the background, abruptly spoke up. "Inspector, there is something I should mention. When I came this evening, I heard voices inside the business. I assumed it was Lady Bantry and one of the other volunteers, but now I'm wondering." When Inspector Slack heard voices, his attention was drawn to them. "Could you recognize them?" Miss Oswald responded warily, saying she felt she knew Mr. Drake's voice. "He seemed to be arguing with someone, though I couldn't make out the words or identify the other participant." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "We'll need statements from everyone in the shop today, and I'd need to know the specific movements of all volunteers and guests." As the inspector began his preliminary assessment of the scene, Lady Bantry recalled Miss Marple's polite observation that morning about books concealing their actual value under plain fabric. She had a developing hunch that the events of this awful evening had revealed secrets that someone was desperate to keep buried. The calm world of Bantry's old books had been destroyed, and she was concerned that before Inspector Slack's investigation was over, more than one person's carefully created facade would be peeled away to reveal the truth beneath. Chapter 4. Miss Marple Reads the Dust. The morning sun streamed through Miss Marple's cottage windows as she sat at her small breakfast table, methodically buttering her toast and absorbing the shocking news delivered to her by Mrs. Price, the village postmistress, who arrived breathless. On her doorstep at 8 a.m. Miss Marple is dead, and poor Mr. Drake is crushed behind one of those enormous bookcases. "Though, between you and me," Mrs. Price added, with the conspiratorial air of one who thrived on dramatic revelations, Dr. Haydock was heard to say it wasn't quite as simple as that. Miss Marple had listened with the same care she gave to all village intelligence, her knitting needles clicking slowly as she digested the data. The news disturbed her greatly, not least since the previous day's events at the bookshop had awoken her instincts. The binding paste on Hugo Drake's fingertips, his concern over the tennis and volume, and the overall feeling of suppressed tension all hinted that something was not quite right. By 9 o'clock, she had made her decision. A brief phone call to Lady Bantry verified that, while the bookshop remained closed per Inspector Slack's orders, there was no problem to her paying a sympathy call at Gossington Hall. What Inspector Slack didn't realize, Miss Marple mused as she packed a handbag and walking stick, was that her path to the main house would take her past the scene of the tragedy. The carriage house stood silent in the morning light, its joyful sign from the previous day's opening, appearing almost mockingly bright in comparison to the severity of the recent events. Yellow tape had been stretched across the entryway, and a constable stood guard, but he seemed more interested in his morning newspaper than in keeping rigorous attention. "Good morning, Constable Williams," Miss Marple greeted sweetly, recognizing the young man as her charwoman's nephew. "Such a terrible business." "Morning, Miss Marple," the constable said, looking up from his paper. "However, Inspector Slack's orders state that no one should enter. I suppose there's no danger in looking through the window." "It's actually quite shocking. I never anticipated anything like this to happen in a bookstore." Miss Marple positioned herself at the window with the best view of the poetic alcove. Her keen eyes absorbed every detail of the scene within. The bookcase had been written on and moved aside, revealing the location where Drake's body had been found. The volumes remained spread on the floor, awaiting the inspector's more thorough assessment. What struck her right away was the selective nature of the destruction. Only one bookshelf had fallen, but the rest remained in their tidy rows. Even more significant was the entire absence of dust on the other shelves, their surfaces immaculate and clean, a testament to Miss Oswald's fastidious care. "Constable Williams," she added thoughtfully, "I don't suppose you've noticed anything particular about the dust patterns?" The young man appeared bewildered. "Dust patterns, Miss Marple?" "Well, you see, when furniture falls or rooms are disturbed, dust gets displaced rather significantly. However, check at the other shelves. They appear unaffected, as if the disturbance was very confined." As she talked, her gaze was drawn to something glinting on the floor near Drake's body. Even at this distance, she could make out what appeared to be small flecks of gold scattered across the dark wood. "Gold leaf?" she said to herself, recalling the gilt calligraphy on the book spines, but these flecks were fresh, almost clean, in stark contrast to the aged gilding found in vintage volumes. Lady Bantry arrived, interrupting her investigation with the somewhat worn appearance of someone who had not slept well the night before. "Jane, my dear," Lady Bantry murmured, her voice full of relief, "I'm so delighted you've arrived. This entire situation has been such a shock." "I can well imagine," Miss Marple said gently. "What a tragedy, especially in what should have been such a happy venture." Lady Bantry said, lowering her voice, "The inspector has been asking the most extraordinary questions about who had access to the shop, and whether anyone had reason to wish Mr. Drake harm, as if anyone in our small hamlet was capable of such a thing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, although her mind was racing. "I think he must investigate all possibilities. Dolly, has anything been taken from the shop? Are there any books missing?" Lady Bantry seemed astonished by the question. "Why, I had not thought to check." Despite the chaos, the inspector quickly sealed the area. "But obviously this was an accident. Dr. Haydock indicated a strike to the head. But couldn't this have happened when the bookcase fell?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Yet I noticed the officer indicated that a ladder was discovered at the scene. Isn't it unusual that someone was using a ladder in the poetry alley after closing time?" Miss Marple's eye was drawn to a small piece of paper that appeared to have eluded the authorities' rapid notice. It was partially concealed beneath one of the strewn volumes, and she could just make out handwriting in violet ink. "Dolly," she said casually, "I was wondering if you could ask the constable about that piece of paper there. It appears as though it might be essential." Lady Bantry followed her sight and instantly cried out to Constable Williams, "I say, Constable, there's a paper there that might be significant." The young man approached the window and looked in. He said it appeared to be a torn catalog card. "I suppose I'll mention it to the inspector when he returns." But Miss Marple had already seen everything she needed to see. Even at this distance, she could make out some letters that looked to read, "Lot 27, Tennyson First, 300 Reserve." The significance of this was not lost on her, especially given Drake's concern over the Tennyson volume the day before. "How curious," she said quietly. Pound 300 seems rather a high reserve for a single volume, doesn't it? Well, first editions can be extremely precious, Lady Bantry said, but she sounded hesitant. Though, I must admit, I had expected the reserve to be significantly lower. Miss Oswald remarked £30 as she was preparing the catalogue. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. A difference between £30 and £300 was significant, and the type of change that could easily justify frantic action. Miss Marple looked out the window one last time as they prepared to leave the site. Her acute eyes had detected something that she feared the inspector could have overlooked in his preliminary assessment. Drake's coat cuff was clearly visible even from this distance, as were what appeared to be small gold flecks, like to those she had seen on the floor. The implications were intriguing. If Drake had lately worked with gilded materials, the gold flecks and binding paste on his fingers the day before would make sense. But what newly gilded materials might a London rare book merchant have come across in a country charity shop? As they moved back toward the main house, Miss Marple began to form a mental image of the previous evening's events. Drake had stayed behind after closing time, either by choice or by stealth. He had been involved in some action involving newly bound or restored books, which had somehow led to his death. The ripped catalog card indicated that the Tennyson volume was at the heart of whatever had happened. However, it was unclear if Drake was the perpetrator or the victim of a lie. "Jane," Lady Bantry said as they approached the front entrance of Gossington Hall, "I hope this does not reflect negatively on the charity. We've worked extremely hard to develop the bookshop, and the roof cash is badly needed." "I'm sure everything will be settled satisfactory," Miss Marple said. But privately she suspected that the resolution might prove more complex than anyone yet recognized. The evidence suggested a well-planned deceit, which in her experience rarely involved only one individual. As she settled into Lady Bantry's comfortable sitting room for what she hoped would be an informative talk, Miss Marple reflected on how the dust patterns in the bookshop had conveyed a narrative. The question now was whether she could accurately interpret that story before Inspector Slack's probe took an unexpected turn. Chapter 5. Forgery in the First Edition. The coroner's inquest into Hugo Drake's death was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Inspector Slack made it clearly clear that the bookshop would not be reopened or the planned charity auction would take place until the procedures were completed. The books remained trapped within the carriage house, like exhibits in a museum of sorrow, while the community swirled with speculation about what had really transpired that fatal evening. Miss Marple had spent the ensuing days in peaceful reflection, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she sorted through the different threads of information that had come to her attention. The gold flecks on Drake's cuff, the binding paste on his fingers, and the altered catalog card all pointed to some type of book trade deceit, but the specifics remained a mystery. Miss Clarissa Oswald appeared at her gate on Friday afternoon, while she was sitting in her garden, enjoying the last warmth of the Indian summer. The village librarian appeared much more controlled than she had on the night of the tragedy, but her uneasy demeanor showed she was still deeply impacted by recent events. "Miss Marple," she continued nervously, "I wonder if I could infringe on your time for a few minutes. There's something bothering me, and I don't know who else to turn to." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple answered, setting down her knitting. "Please do come inside. I'll put the kettle on." Miss Oswald reclined into the chintz-covered armchair that Miss Marple had recommended, her hands twitching with the latch of her purse. "It's about the bookshop," she began, "and something I found before to the tragic event." Miss Marple preoccupied herself with tea preparations, allowing the silence to motivate her visitor to continue. She had learned from experience that when people are not pressed for information, they typically reveal more. "You see," Miss Oswald continued, her voice becoming stronger, "I was working on the final catalog listings the day before the launch when I came across something strange. 2 copies of the same book." "2 copies?" Miss Marple urged gently, placing the teapot on its holder. Miss World clarified Tennyson's first edition. Mr. Drake was particularly concerned about this one. While conducting my final inventory check, I discovered what looked to be duplicate entries in my notes. At first, I assumed it was merely an error on my part, but when I went to verify the actual volumes, she paused, evidently wrestling with the ramifications of her discovery. I discovered 2 identical copies of In Memoriam, both appearing to be first editions from 1850 and bound in the same style of Moroccan leather with gilt lettering. To the untrained eye, they were identical. Miss Marple poured the tea steadily, despite her racing mind. That is very curious. What did you make of this discovery? At first, I was simply perplexed. Mrs. Weatherby's donation of 2 copies of the same valuable book appeared implausible, yet when I checked them all closely, Miss Oswald took her teacup with trembling hands. One was obviously genuine. The paper had an old feel about it. The binding displayed adequate wear, and the typography was correct for an 1850 printing. What about the other? Miss Oswald whispered. The other was perfect. Too perfect. The binding was perfect. The gilt lettering was fresh and vibrant. And when I studied the paper with my magnifying glass, I noticed that it lacked the minor defects that one would anticipate from a genuine 19th century print. Miss Marple laid down her teacup with care. Miss Oswald, are you claiming that one of the books was forged? I'm saying that one of them was unquestionably a modern replica done with great ability, but it was still clearly recent work. The glue in the binding had barely set, and there were microscopic residues of modern adhesive that would not have been employed in 1850. Consequences of this knowledge hung over the tea table like a shadow. Miss Marple recalled Drake's anger over the tennis volume, his insistence on more scrutiny, and his desperate attempt to remove it from the shop. Miss Oswald, she said gently, what happened to these 2 books? Did you report your discovery to Lady Bantry? Miss Oswald blushed with humiliation. I'm afraid I didn't know just what to do. If I reported it, there would be inquiries about how such a situation had occurred, and I was afraid it would reflect negatively on my cataloging talents. I decided to investigate the situation more thoroughly before raising any concerns. Did you have the opportunity to do so? That's just it, Miss Oswald answered, her voice rising slightly. When I returned to the shop on the evening of the tragedy, I planned to do a more in-depth comparison of the 2 books. But when I looked for them, I could only find 1 copy of Tennyson. Miss Marple's eyebrows raised. Only one? Which one? The genuine one, Miss Oswald declared confidently. The book that survived was undoubtedly the original. The reproduction had disappeared. This information shed new light on the evening's events. If Drake had received the fake copy, this would explain his anger and desperate attempts to remove it from the business. However, it would imply that someone had deliberately deceived others by exchanging a worthless duplicate for a priceless original. Miss Oswald, Miss Marple replied gently, I was wondering if you could tell me exactly what you saw when you arrived at the shop that evening. You told Inspector Slack that you heard voices. Miss Oswald nodded, her calm beginning to wane. I had gone the outside stairs to the shop, planning to fetch my reading glasses and to study the Tennyson problem more attentively. As I approached the door, I could hear voices from within, one of which was unmistakably Mr. Drake's. Could you make out what they were saying? Not quite, but it sounded like an argument. Mr. Drake seemed agitated, and I overheard him mention something about the original and £300. The other voice was lower, but I got the idea that someone was trying to calm him down. Did you recognize the other's voice? Miss Oswald paused. I thought I did, but I can't be sure. The acoustics in the old structure are rather unusual, and voices can sound different when one is listening from outside. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. And then what happened? I heard a sound like something dropping. Then there was a devastating crash. I waited for a bit, believing that someone had simply knocked down a stack of books. But then I heard something that sounded like a plea for aid. And that's when you entered the store. Yes, a jar was left in the window. I saw the scene much like Lady Bantry did, with the bookshelf collapsed and poor Mr. Drake stuck behind it. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. The growing picture suggested a complicated trick in which a fake book was substituted for a genuine one. However, it was unclear whether Drake was the perpetrator or victim of the deception. Miss Oswald ultimately stated, "I believe it would be wise for you to share this information with Inspector Slack. The availability of 2 copies of Tennyson's poem, as well as the disappearance of one, may be critical to understanding what transpired that night." Miss Oswald appeared apprehensive. "But won't it appear suspicious that I didn't report the matter right away? Inspector Slack seemed to be suspicious of me, given that I discovered the body." Miss Marple stated with mild firmness that she believes the inspector will be more interested in the information than the timing of its disclosure. The truth will ultimately come out, and it is often preferable to help rather than obstruct that process. As Miss Oswald prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the strange case of the 2 Tennyson volumes. The presence of a skilled forgery indicated meticulous planning and extensive expertise. However, Drake's death was preceded by a quick substitution and a desperate debate, implying that something went wrong with whatever plan was in the works. The question now was whether Drake had been the forger attempting to scam the charity, or whether he had discovered someone else's deception and paid the ultimate price for that information. The gold flecks on his cuff and the binding paste on his fingers suggested that he had worked on the forged book, but they may also imply that he had examined it rather than created it. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple observed that the case was like a sophisticated piece of embroidery, with threads of truth and falsehood intertwined in a pattern that was only beginning to appear. But she was confident that with time and careful observation, the entire design would eventually be revealed. Chapter 6. Whispering Behind the Binding Press. Miss Marple's talk with Miss Oswald gave an important piece of the jigsaw, but it also created more questions than it solved. The presence of 2 Tennyson books, one real and one counterfeit, suggested a well-planned deceit, but the forger's name remained tantalizingly unknown. As she sat in her garden the following morning, watching the postman make his rounds, she found herself thinking the practical challenges of producing such a believable duplicate. Book forging, she realized, was not a skill that could be learned overnight. It required not just artistic aptitude, but also access to the necessary materials and equipment. The binding paste on Drake's fingers, the fresh gilt lettering that Miss Oswald had noticed, and the high quality of the reproduction all indicated the work of a skilled craftsman. This line of thinking naturally took her to the many bookbinding shops in the region. St. Mary had merely a little stationer shop, but the adjoining market town of Much Benham had several larger enterprises, including what she remembered as a fascinating little boundary set away behind the major street. The prospect of a beautiful morning walk to Much Benham, combined with the opportunity to learn something practical about current bookbinding operations, was alluring. Miss Marple took her handbag and walking stick and started off on the familiar path that linked the 2 settlements. Briar Bindi occupied a narrow building sandwiched between a baker's business and a wool merchant's establishment. The painted sign above the entrance said E. Judge Bookbinder and Restorer, and the small painted windows provided views of the craftsman's workplace inside. Miss Marple paused to examine the display of restored volumes in the window, noting the high quality of the workmanship and the proprietor's obvious pride in his craft. A bell rang as she pulled open the door, and she was immediately immersed in the binder's peculiar vibe. The air was thick with the scent of leather, glue, and old paper, and the walls were lined with shelves of books in various states of repair. A man in his 50s stood at a workbench near the window, looking up from his work with a kind face. "Good morning, madam," he remarked, setting aside the volume he had been studying. I am Edward Rudge. How can I help you? Miss Marple approached the desk with her usual sense of polite curiosity. Good morning, Mr. Rudge. What an amazing establishment you have here. I'm Miss Marple from St. Mary, and I've been admiring your art in the window display. Mr. Rudd's face lit up with professional pride. Thank you, Miss Marple. I try to retain the traditional standards. A lot of current binding work lacks the attention to detail that the trade requires. Miss Marple agreed, observing the different tools and materials organized on the workbench. I guess you see a lot of intriguing books in your area of work. Rare volumes, first editions, and the like. Oh, certainly. Only last week, I had a gentleman bring in a really rare poetry collection. It was Victorian and required expert treatment. Miss Marple's interest heightened, though she maintained her appearance of casual wonder. How fascinating! I sincerely hope the restoration was effective. Mr. Raj, resting against his workbench, observed. That's the curious thing. The gentleman was very picky about the work being done swiftly. They paid me more to work through the night. In actuality, it stated that it was required for some sort of auction or show. Miss Marple remarked on how dedicated you were to accommodating this request. Working with valuable books, I believe, takes a high level of competence. Mr. Rudd concurred, warming to the issue. This volume was the first edition of Tennyson's In Memoriam. The original binding was beautiful, but the hinges and spine needed some care. The gentleman was really particular about reproducing the original giltwork perfectly. Miss Marple nodded attentively. And was this gentleman one of your regular customers? Oh no. This was the first time I had seen him. A well-dressed fellow. Spoke with a London accent. Stated he was a rare book merchant down from the city for business. He seemed to know his way around valuable volumes. I will give him that. The description fit Hugo Drake perfectly, and Miss Marple felt a small rush of confirmation. I don't suppose you remember his name. I simply ask since I am a book collector myself, and am always interested in learning about reliable merchants. Mr. Rudge scratched his head thoughtfully. Drake? I believe Hugo Drake left his card, but I don't expect to see him again. The payment was in cash, and it was fairly generous, and the task was done to his satisfaction. Oh, absolutely well done. If I may say so myself. The binding was in excellent condition, and the gilt lettering was identical to the original. Of course, working through the night, I may have used a little more adhesive than was strictly necessary, but the gentleman didn't appear to notice. Miss Marple's heart accelerated. The fresh binding paste, crisp gilt lettering, and nightwork all matched the evidence she had seen. However, one critical question remained. Mr. Rudge, she added gently, I'm interested in the materials you utilize for such restoration work. I imagine that replicating 19th century procedures necessitates access to period-appropriate supplies. Ah, that's where experience comes in, Mr. Rudge said. Moving to a cabinet containing various papers and stuff. Modern materials are ideal for everyday use. But for costly items, one needs to choose papers and adhesives that match the original, as nearly as possible. He brought out a drawer containing sheets of marble paper in various patterns and colors. For example, this marble paper is necessary for constructing period-end papers. I retain a collection of patterns that correspond to the most frequent 19th century designs. Miss Marple looked at the documents with curiosity, noticing their obvious quality and authenticity. How incredible! And I'm guessing you generate a lot of rubbish as part of your job. Oh, certainly. Offcuts, trimmings, and like. I tried to save the larger pieces for future projects, but there's always a fair quantity that will only fit in the waste bin. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to the waste bin next to Mr. Rudd's workbench, as if by an unseen link. Even from her vantage point at the counter, she could see shreds of marbled paper amid the binder's other trash. Mr. Rudge, she began, I wonder whether you could satisfy an elderly woman's curiosity. I am really interested in the marbled paper design in your wastebasket. It's extremely stunning. Mr. R.J. followed her gaze and reached into the bin, pulling out several pieces of marbled paper. Ah, yes, these are from the Tennyson project. Beautiful pattern, isn't it? I'm afraid I may have been a little wasteful with it. The client was pretty insistent on the quality of the work, and I wanted to make certain of creating the proper impact. Miss Marple looked at the paper shreds with great curiosity. The marbling was stunning, with swirling blue and gold patterns that would have been ideal for a 19th century binding. What struck her the most was the paper's obvious freshness. How clever, she muttered, brushing her fingers across the papers. Surface. The aging technique is quite convincing. Mr. Rudge seems pleased with her admiration. Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a process I've developed over the years that combines tea staining and cautious exposure to regulated heat. The end result is almost indistinguishable from genuine vintage paper. The consequences of this revelation were significant. If Drake commissioned the development of convincing period materials, it was possible that he was engaged in the production of the counterfeit Tennyson volume. However, it was unclear if he had acted as the forger or simply an intermediary. Miss Marple finally asked Mr. Rudge if he would be willing to speak with Inspector Slack of the St. Mary's Police. I'm afraid there's been some trouble with rare books, and your expertise could be helpful in resolving the situation. Mr. Rogers' countenance became serious. Of course, Miss Marple, I do hope there's nothing wrong about the work I accomplished. The gentleman appeared to be a respectable customer, and he paid swiftly. I'm sure you've done nothing wrong, Miss Marple assured him. But your information about the restoration work could be very helpful in understanding what happened. As she prepared to leave the binder, Miss Marple considered the image that was emerging. Hugo Drake was certainly involved in the creation or commissioning of a forged Tennyson volume, employing materials and techniques that would have been convincing to any but the most discerning inspection. The question now was whether he had worked alone or as part of a larger plot. Mr. Rudd's waste bin included shreds of artificially aged paper, which served as silent witnesses to a lie that eventually led to murder. However, they also revealed critical evidence that could assist Inspector Slack uncover the truth about the tragedy at Bantry's old books. But the most crucial question went unanswered. Who had been Drake's accomplice, and what had motivated that person to commit murder? When their meticulously prepared plans began to unravel. Chapter 7. Footprints on the library steps. The rain, which had began as a steady drizzle on Miss Marple's return journey from Much Benham, had turned into a full downpour by evening, banging against the windows of her cottage, the perseverance of autumn imposing its dominance over the final remnants of summer. She had spent the afternoon in peaceful reflection, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she considered the implications of her finding at Bantry. The data began to create a logical pattern, similar to the elaborate design of the anti-massa she was building. Hugo Drake had certainly been engaged in the construction of a fake Tennyson volume, but whether he was the brains behind the deceit or simply a tool in someone else's scheme was frustratingly unclear. He appeared to be genuinely concerned about the book's veracity, implying that he could have been both a victim and a perpetrator. It was shortly after 9 o'clock when her phone rang, its shrill tone piercing through the constant banging of rain on glass. Lady Bantry's response was marked by a palpable sense of exhilaration. "Jane, my love, I hope I am not disturbing you at this hour, but something extraordinary has occurred. Inspector Slack has been inspecting the outside of the bookshop and has uncovered something potentially significant." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with meticulous precision. "What kind of discovery, Dolly?" "Footprints," Lady Bantry replied with a secretive whisper. "The rain has uncovered a series of muddy tracks on the outside stairs leading to the business. The inspector believes they're distinct, and he's been able to ascertain the size and pattern of the shoes used to make them." Miss Marple whispered something interesting as she reached for her coat. "I doubt Inspector Slack would object to my inspecting these tracks. In fact, he specifically requested if I could get you to join him. He appears to value your observations, albeit he never expresses them openly." Miss Marple smiled at herself. Inspector Slack's grudging regard for her abilities was one of the few benefits she got from their occasional partnerships. "I'll be right. There, Dolly. The rain should help to protect the prince until I can examine him." Her sturdy umbrella and a good pair of galoshes helped her get to Gossington Hall in the rainy evening. The rain had converted the typically tidy patio into a muddy expanse that meticulously tracked every footstep. Inspector Slack stood beneath the overhang of the carriage house roof, holding his notes and smiling professionally. "Ah, Miss Marple," he replied, nodding quickly. "It is admirable of you to come out in this weather. I thought you would be interested in these prints." Miss Marple ascended the outside stairs that led to the shop's entrance, her practiced eye immediately taking in the significance of what the rain had exposed. A single set of footprints ascended the wooden steps, the impressions plain and unmistakable in the mud that had gathered in the nooks and fissures of the aged planks. Inspector Slack, reading his notes, stated size 5 shoes. Women's, I believe, with a noticeable worn pattern on the left sole. Whoever created these prints climbed these stairs on the evening of the murder. Miss Marple carefully examined the impressions, noting not only their size and pattern, but also their depth and space. "The gait shows that someone is familiar with these stairs," she noted. "The spacing appears confident rather than tentative, as if someone were climbing them for the first time in the dark." "My sentiments exactly," Inspector Slack concurred. "There's something else. The prints go up, but there is no convincing proof that they come down. The rain may have washed away the falling prints, but it's still intriguing." As they investigated the site, Miss Marple noticed a stranger approaching through the rain. Miss Clarissa Oswald dashed toward them, her umbrella dripping with water and her face betraying signs of great anxiety. "Inspector Slack," she cried out as she drew near. "I just heard about the footprints. I am afraid I must speak with you." The inspector focused his attention on the village librarian, his gaze sharpened with professional curiosity. "Miss Oswald, do you have information relevant to these prints?" Miss Oswald's equanimity, which had been slowly returning since the night of the tragedy, appeared to disintegrate completely. "I'm afraid they're mine," she added in a scarcely audible whisper. "The footprints on the stairs. I climbed them the same evening Mr. Drake was assassinated." Inspector Slack's eyebrows lifted, and Miss Marple noticed how his hand immediately moved toward his notebook. "Indeed. And why didn't you mention this earlier?" Miss Oswald inquired. "Because I was afraid," Miss Oswald said, her voice becoming stronger as she went on. "I told you I entered the shop through the window, which was correct, but I didn't disclose that I first tried the steps to the main door." "And why didn't you use the main entrance?" Miss Oswald's hands twisted together, indicating anguish. "Because when I got to the top of the steps, I could hear conversations from within the business. Mr. Drake was present, and he appeared to be having a furious altercation with another person." Miss Marple leant forward slightly. "Could you identify the opposing party in this argument?" Miss Oswald lamented. "That's it. I thought I could, but I wasn't confident enough to say anything." The Whir lamented. "That's it. I thought I could, but I wasn't confident enough to say anything." D's were muted by the door, and I was concerned about making a false charge. Inspector Slack's patience had plainly worn thin. "Miss Oswald, I must urge that you tell us exactly what you heard and observed. This is a murder investigation, not a social gathering where one is concerned about hurt feelings." Miss Oswald took a deep breath, obviously fighting with her conscience. "Mr. Drake was really angry. I overheard him mention something about the original, and you cannot get away with it." The other voice attempted to calm him down, but Mr. Drake appeared to be threatening to reveal some form of deceit. "And then what happened?" There was a sound that resembled something heavy falling. The shop's lights went out. I waited for a time, unsure what to do, until I heard what sounded like a plea for aid. Miss Marple paid close attention to Miss Oswald's face. "And that's when you chose to go through the window?" "Yes, but in my rush to go down from the steps, I dropped my torch. I'd been using it to navigate in the dark when it fell to the ground near the bottom of the steps." Inspector Slack made a note. "And what became of the torch?" "I discovered it the next morning, after the constable had arrived. It was laying in the mud near the stairs, but it had been thoroughly cleaned. Someone had clearly handled it after I dropped it." This discovery cast the evening's events in a completely different light. If Miss Oswald had dropped her torch during her rapid flight from the stairs, and if someone had subsequently picked it up and cleaned it, it suggested that the killer had been aware of her presence and had taken pains to erase evidence. "Miss Oswald," Miss Marple continued gently, "you mentioned that you thought you recognized the other voice in the shop. Even if you're not sure, sharing your thoughts could be beneficial." Miss Oswald looked around nervously, as if she feared being overheard. "I thought it may have been Mr. Trent, the historian." The speech had the same intellectual cadence, and I knew he'd spent a long time in the shop, studying the historical collection. Inspector Slack's expression became contemplative. "Basil Trent? Yes, he has been quite accommodating with our inquiries. Now that I think about it, I may have been overly cooperative." Miss Marple reflected on the consequences of Miss Oswald's revelations as they finished their investigation of the footprints. The librarian's story painted a more complete picture of the evening's events, but it also raised troubling concerns about Drake's killer. If Basil Trent had been at the shop that evening arguing with Drake about some form of deception, it was possible that the historian was involved in the forgery scheme. But what might have motivated a respectable scholar to murder? As they made their way back to Gossington Hall for refuge, the rain continued to fall, wiping away the remaining vestiges of evidence from the tragic night. But the footprints on the stairs had revealed their story, and Miss Marple was beginning to discern the outline of a plot that had ended in bloodshed as its meticulously placed intentions unraveled. Chapter 8. The Missing Catalog Card. The morning after the footprints were discovered was clear and bright, as if the previous evening's rain had removed not just the physical signs of mud and debris, but also the suffocating aura that had hovered over the investigation. Miss Marple had spent the night in careful reflection, her mind sifting through the numerous threads of evidence that were beginning to form a recognized pattern. Inspector Slack called at 9 a.m., his voice filled with restrained excitement, as if he had discovered a huge finding. "Miss Marple, I'm wondering if you could join me at the station this morning. I was looking through the Bookshop's auction ledger and came upon something that may be of interest to you." Miss Marple had already reached for her hat. "Of course, Inspector. I'll be there immediately." The police station was housed in a modest structure on the outskirts of Much Benham, its Victorian brick exterior lending it an aura of solid respectability that belied the drama of the cases that occasionally came through its doors. Inspector Slack greeted her at the door, his normally harsh demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine admiration for her investigative skills. "I've been reading over the Bookshop's records," he said without pause, leading her to a small office with numerous paperwork sprawled across a desk. The auction catalog, inventory lists, and reservation book. The majority of it is very obvious, but one issue has piqued my interest. He indicated a leather-bound ledger that lay open on the desk. Its pages are loaded with elegant entries by diverse hands. The auction ledger contains the reserve prices for individual lots. Take a peek at lot 27. Miss Marple leaned forward to investigate the entry in question. The Tennyson First Edition had been allocated the number 27, and she could see that the reserve price had been set to £300. But when she reviewed the entry more attentively, she noticed something that raised her eyebrows somewhat. She mumbled, "The ink is a different color than the rest of the entry." Exactly. Inspector Slack confirms. The book title and lot number are written in black ink, but the reserve price is written in violet, and a close examination reveals that the original entry has been amended. Miss Marple inspected the page with the magnifying lens that Inspector Slack offered. The meticulous examination revealed that the original entry was £30, but the zero had been changed to dir with violet ink, changing the small reserve into a significant one. Someone, she remarked carefully, was eager to boost the estimated value of this lot. My exact thoughts, and the change was made with violet ink, narrowing down our suspect list significantly. Miss Marple nodded, recalling her observations on the different volunteers' writing patterns. Miss Oswald uses green ink for cataloging, while Miss Pettigrew prefers black. But Mr. Trent signs all of his letters in violet ink. Inspector Slack has finished. I validated this by reviewing the letters he wrote to Lady Bantry on his historical research. This revelation shed new insight on Basil Trent's role in the affair. If he had changed the catalog entry to raise the reserve price, it implied not only that he had intended to profit financially from the sale, but also that he had been complicit in the fraud from the start. Inspector, Miss Marple asked gently, have you had occasion to examine Mr. Trent's personal papers? Inspector Slack's countenance darkened. Yes, I have. I went to his cabin this morning with a search warrant. What I discovered there was quite illuminating. He dug inside a folder and took out a checkbook stub. The paper became somewhat yellowed with age. This comes from Mr. Trent's personal account. The stub shows a £300 payment, dated the day before. The murder made out to H. Drake Books. Miss Marple looked at the stub with increased interest. The amount matched exactly the revised reserve price in the auction ledger, and the timing indicated that Trent and Drake had arranged a transaction for the evening of the murder. A payment for books, she reflected. But which books, and for what purpose? That's what I intend to find out, Inspector Slack said coldly. I have invited Mr. Trent to come to the police this afternoon for further questioning. His explanations thus far have been pretty evasive. Miss Marple sat silent for a moment, her mind running through the implications of these revelations. The amended catalog item, the check stub, and Miss Oswald's recognition of Trent's voice all pointed to the historian's involvement in the events of that terrible evening. However, the nature of his role remained unclear. Inspector, she finally began, I wonder if you could let me see the rest of the bookshop's records. There may be more changes or abnormalities that offer light on the situation. Inspector Slack pointed to the pile of documents on the desk. Please be my guests. Your eye for detail has proven useful in the past. Miss Marple spent the next hour carefully analyzing the various data, looking for any anomalies or discrepancies that could indicate the true extent of the fraud. Most of the entries looked to be straightforward, but she did discover many other cases where the ink color suggested that adjustments had been made after the original entries were recorded. Inspector, she ended by saying, I believe the alterations were more extensive than just the Tennyson volume. Several additional valuable products appear to have had their descriptions or reserve pricing changed. Inspector Slack leaned over her shoulder to inspect the entries she had discovered. He noted that everything was written in violet ink, and that it increased the perceived value of the objects in question. Miss Marple noted that it suggests a systematic attempt to inflate the auction's potential proceeds. However, it is unclear if this was done for charitable purposes or to support another scheme. Their conversation was cut short as Constable Williams stood in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. Inspector, he said, I've just been to Mr. Trent's cottage as you requested, and I found something you ought to see. He pulled up a little pamphlet bound in aged calf leather, the pages yellowing with age. This was kept in a secret compartment on Mr. Trent's desk. He claims it's part of his study materials, but it appears quite valuable to me. Miss Marple examined the pamphlet with interest, noting the high quality of the binding and the meticulous preservation of the pages. The title of the book read, A True Relation of the Gospel Oak Rising 1630, and she recalled Trent's mention of his search for contemporary accounts of the Kentish uprisings. This appears to be the type of document that Mr. Trent mentioned. He wanted. She observed a contemporary description of the 1630 rebellion and in outstanding condition. Inspector Slack's expression became contemplative. The question is, where did he get it? And how does it relate to the happenings at the bookstore? Miss Marple took a closer look at the pamphlet and found something that gave her pause. The binding. Though antique, exhibited traces of recent disturbance. The leather was slightly loose around the corners, with evidence of what seemed to be new adhesive down the spine. Inspector, she added gently, I believe this pamphlet may have been concealed within another book, and only recently extracted. The consequences of this revelation were significant. If the booklet had been hidden within one of the books donated to the charity shop, it would explain Trent's strong interest in the collection, as well as his readiness to change the auction records to ensure that specific volumes remained available for his investigation. But what book? Inspector Slack mused. And how did Drake get involved in the scheme? Miss Marple could see the beginnings of a complicated deceit that included not only the counterfeit of the Tennyson volume, but also the hiding and theft of a truly priceless historical document. Trent had offered Drake £300 in exchange for his participation, according to the check stub, but something had gone wrong with their deal. I suppose, she added carefully, that we need to know exactly what Mr. Trent intended to accomplish with both the booklet and the falsified Tennyson. The answer to such question may offer the motive for murder. Chapter 9. Midnight in the Folios. Miss Marple had suggested setting up a midnight vigil at the bookshop, based on her growing conviction that the case was far from over, despite the mounting evidence against Basil Trent. The historian's reaction throughout his afternoon inquiry struck her as genuine perplexity rather than the deliberate deception of a guilty guy. His explanations, while incomplete, had the ring of truth when he spoke of his scholarly pursuits and desperate search for the missing pamphlet. Inspector Slack was first doubtful of her proposition, but her reasoning eventually convinced him. If Trent was truly guilty of murder, he would hardly risk returning to the scene of the crime. However, if he was innocent of Drake's death while still implicated in the theft of the booklet, he might try to recover his prize before the investigation can locate its hiding spot. Miss Marple said that the man is fascinated with his research. As they took up positions in the shadow of the carriage house, if the pamphlet represents years of intellectual research, he will not discard it because of recent events. Academic passion can push people to extraordinary lengths. Inspector Slack, crouching awkwardly behind a pile of garden tools, murmured something unsettling about the lengths amateur detectives would go to pursue their beliefs. But Miss Marple saw that his gaze remained fixed on the bookshop's entrance, and his hand was within easy reach of his whistle. The village church clock had barely struck midnight when they heard the first noises of movement within the shuttered edifice. Someone was moving around with apparent familiarity, navigating the tiny corridors between the bookcases with the assurance of long experience. He's inside, Inspector Slack said quietly, his voice barely audible. But how did he get inside? The doors are locked, and Williams had already checked all of the windows. Miss Marple's keen eyes had been scanning the building's exterior, and she had noticed something that the inspector had apparently overlooked. The coal cellar, she muttered. There's an old coal chute that leads to the basement. Someone knowledgeable with the building's history might be aware of its presence. The sounds from inside became more intentional, and they could hear the distinct scrape of heavy furniture moving through the glass. They noticed the flickering light of a torch or lantern moving across the shop's interior. He's heading for the Atlas section, Inspector Slack said, noting the direction of the light. Far corner, near where the historical collection is housed. Miss Marple nodded, her mind working quickly. If the booklet was hidden within one of the larger volumes, an atlas would be the ideal hiding spot. The binding would be strong enough to hold such an item without noticeable distortion. They gazed in curiosity as the light traveled quickly through the shop. The burglar appeared to know exactly what he was looking for, and his movements indicated the urgent efficiency of someone working against the clock. Inspector Slack abruptly announced that he had discovered something. Through the window, they could see a figure bent over what appeared to be a cabinet or chest, his hands working quickly at some sort of concealed mechanism. The light from his torch revealed enough of his profile to put his identification beyond doubt. "Basil Trent, miss," Marple said with delight, precisely as I had suspected. The historian's motions had taken on a triumphant tone, and they could see him carefully taking something from what appeared to be a concealed chamber inside the atlas cabinet. Even from this distance, the object in his hands was undeniably the calf-bound brochure they had viewed earlier at the police station. "But wait," Inspector Slack remarked, his voice sharp and confused. "If we found the pamphlet in his cottage, how can he be retrieving it now?" Miss Marple's expression became contemplative. "Perhaps what we discovered wasn't the sole copy. Perhaps there were additional documents concealed with it. Mr. Trent's research has been comprehensive, and there may be more to this revelation than we previously thought." Trent's behavior grew more agitated as they watched. He appeared to be hunting for something more, his movements increasing more frenzied as he searched the secret compartment with rising desperation. Miss Marple remarked that he is looking for something that does not exist, something he anticipated to find, but was unable to locate. Inspector Slack was already approaching the building's entrance. "I believe we've seen enough. Time to apprehend our nighttime visitor," but Miss Marple grabbed his arm. "Wait, Inspector. Let him finish his search. We may learn more by monitoring his entire acts rather than interrupting them prematurely." Trent's search had become more urgent, and they could hear books being moved and papers being jumbled as he investigated the contents of the concealed compartment with greater intensity. His torch beam raced back and forth across the interior of the cabinet, offering glimpses of what appeared to be a well-planned hiding location. "A genius," Miss Marple said quietly. "A fake back to the atlas cabinet, accessible only to those who know the secret to its operation. However, Mr. Trent has definitely not found what he expected." The historian's motions had become increasingly frenzied, and they could hear him muttering to himself as he investigated the hidden area. His voice rang clear through the quiet night air, and they could make out parts of his increasingly desperate diatribe. "It has to be here," he said. "Drake promised that it would be safe. The actual manuscript, proof of the gospel conspiracy, holds the key to everything." Inspector Slack stared at Miss Marple with raised eyes. "Original manuscript. I assumed the booklet was the reward he was after." Miss Marple carefully considered whether the brochure was simply a pointer to something far more important, a map leading to a greater treasure. Trent's search was becoming increasingly frustrating, and they could hear him swearing under his breath as he explored every area of the concealed compartment. His torch beam revealed the hiding place's thorough design, including fitting shelves and a strong latching mechanism. "Drake, you fool!" he yelled aloud, his voice clearly audible in the night air. "You vowed you'd return it where it belonged. Where is Cromwell's letter?" Even Inspector Slack could hear Miss Marple's intake of breath. "A Cromwell letter?" She whispered. That would indeed be a prize beyond price for a historian specialized on the Civil War period. The consequences were astounding. If Oliver Cromwell had written a letter about the Gospel Oak Rising, it would represent not only tremendous historical importance, but also considerable monetary worth. Such a document would be worth much more than Trent's £300 payment to Drake. But where is it? Inspector Slack inquired. If it isn't in the hiding place, and Drake has died, where has it gone? Miss Marple was gradually gaining insight into Trent's increasingly frenzied actions. "I believe," she added slowly, "that we misread the nature of the deal between Mr. Trent and Mr. Drake. Perhaps Drake was Trent's victim rather than an accomplice in thievery." Trent's search had reached a point of full desperation, and they could hear him sobbing in frustration as he realized his prize was nowhere to be found. His torch beam swept one last time through the empty compartment before he leaned against the cabinet, defeated. "It's gone," he announced to the gloom. "Drake hid it somewhere else, and I'll never find it. Years of investigation, and it was all for nothing." Inspector Slack was already advancing toward the building's entrance, his patience running out. "Time for our conversation with Mr. Trent," he stated sadly. "And this time, I want the complete truth." As they neared the bookstore, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of deception and scholastic obsession that had led to this point. The case was far from over, but she was beginning to realize the actual nature of the crime that had occurred. Amid the tranquil setting of Lady Bantry's philanthropic initiative. Chapter 10. Revelation over morning cocoa. The breakfast room at Gossington Hall had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered the next morning. Lady Bantry, still dressed in her dressing gown and appearing little unkempt after the previous night's dramatic events, presided over the tea service with the air of a hostess who had found herself entertaining at an unusual time. Colonel Bantry, roused from his bed by the ruckus, sat at the head of the table, his countenance resigned, as if he had learnt not to question the odd circumstances that occasionally broke his quiet retirement. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window, her knitting bag by her side, and her sharp eyes moved between the assembled company with the care of a conductor preparing to direct a complicated musical performance. Inspector Slack, looking slightly rumpled from his midnight vigil, had accepted Lady Bantry's invitation to join them for what she had tactfully described as a discussion of recent events. Basil Trent sat slightly away from the others. His intellectual serenity was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of the night's revelations. The historian's typically impeccable appearance reflected his ordeal in the coal bunker, and his hands trembled slightly as he accepted Lady Bantry's cup of tea. "Now then," Miss Marple murmured softly, putting her knitting on her lap, "I believe it is time we had a full accounting of what has happened. Mr. Trent, please tell us about your finding of the historical records." Trent's pale eyes briefly met hers before returning to his teacup. "It started out simply," he remarked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was researching the Gospel Oak Rising for my book about Kentish uprisings, and I came across references to records that were thought to have been lost during the Civil War." "What sort of documents?" Inspector Slack asked, holding his notes ready. "Contemporary accounts of the uprising, correspondence between participants, and most importantly, a letter from Oliver Cromwell about the government's response to the rebellion." Trent's voice grew stronger as he discussed his academic passion. Such a letter would be the most important discovery in Civil War studies in decades. Miss Marple nodded enthusiastically. "Do you believe these documents could be found in private collections?" Mrs. Weatherby's late husband had been a noted collector of Civil War material, Trent continued. "When she gave his library to a charity store, I volunteered to help with the cataloging in the hope of finding some trace of the documents I sought." "And you found them?" Trent's composure crumbled completely. "I discovered the pamphlet first, tucked beneath the boards of the Tennyson volume. It was just what I'd been looking for, a contemporary account of the Gospel Oak Rising that acknowledged the presence of Cromwell's letter." Lady Bantry sat her teacup down with a crisp snap. "Mr. Trent, are you admitting you erased historical papers from volumes donated to charity?" Trent was desperate to return them. "I only wanted to study them to ensure their validity. I had no intention of retaining them permanently." Miss Marple's knitting needle started to click gently. "But something went wrong with your plans, didn't it, Mr. Trent?" "Hugo Drake discovered what I had done," Trent confessed, his voice full of shame. He had been looking through the Tennyson volume when he saw that the binding had been disturbed. When he confronted me, I was obliged to confess. Inspector Slack leaned forwards. And what did Mr. Drake intend to do with this information? He offered to help me, Trent replied, his tone bitterly ironic. He claimed he could build an exact replica of the Tennyson volume, concealing the fact that the original had been tampered with. In exchange, he requested remuneration for his services, and the right to sell the reproduction as a genuine first edition. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. So Mr. Drake intended to cheat the charity by swapping a fake for the original Tennyson. Yes, but I was desperate to avoid the scandal. My reputation, my research, and all I had worked for would have been shattered if it had been discovered that I was deleting documents from donated volumes. The image was growing clearer, and Miss Marple recognized the fatal flaw in the murder plot. But the plan started to crumble, didn't it? Trent nodded pathetically. Drake grew greedy. He had found that the Cromwell letter was hidden in the booklet, and recognized its great worth. He requested not just the agreed-upon sum of £300, but also the right to privately sell the letter to overseas collectors. "And you refused?" Trent exclaimed. "I couldn't allow it. That letter belongs to English history, scholarship, and the country itself." Drake wanted to sell it to the highest bidder, no matter where it would end up. Inspector Slack's visage became grimmer. "So you arranged to meet him at the bookshop that evening?" "I tried to reason with him," Trent said, his voice becoming increasingly irritated. "I offered him more money and promised him recognition for his role in the discovery, but he refused. He had the letter and planned to profit from it." Miss Marple sat down with her knitting and looked directly at Trent. "And that's when you struck him with the counterfeit Tenny volume." The charge hung in the air like a physical presence, turning Trent's face totally white. He murmured, "It was an accident. We were arguing, and he threatened to reveal everything. He held the letter in his palm, taunting me. And I lost my temper." "You whacked him with the thick reproduction book Drake had ordered," Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "The new binding paste from the fake was still on the volume, which is why it was discovered on Drake's fingertips. I didn't mean to kill him," Trent said, his voice breaking. "All I wanted was to stop him from destroying years of research. When I realized what I had done, I panicked." Inspector Slack had been taking notes during the confession and now looked up with professional attention. "You then faked the mishap with the bookcase," Trent stated. "I thought if it appeared that he had been killed accidentally, there would be no investigation into the missing documents. I propped his body beneath the bookcase, pushed it over, and scattered the binding paste on the ladder, implying he had been working on the upper shelves." Miss Marple nodded attentively. The undisturbed dust on the other shelves indicated that just one bookcase had fallen, implying that the accident was staged, and the gold flecks on Drake's sleeve was from the pamphlet's told spine, showing that he had handled the historical records. "But where is the Cromwell letter now?" Lady Bantry asked. "If it wasn't in the hiding place where you expected to find it." Trent's expression became even more desperate. "Drake must have hidden it elsewhere before our meeting. He was too astute to bring such an important material into a confrontation. It could be any place." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their quiet click. "Actually," she answered calmly, "I believe I know exactly where it is." The ripped catalog card discovered at the scene was not only proof of the revised reserve price. This was Drake's insurance coverage. She dipped into her reticule and took out a small piece of paper. "This is the remaining half of the catalog card, which I discovered yesterday when looking through the shop's records. It contains Drake's notation concerning the true hiding site of the Cromwell letter." Inspector Slack looked at the document, amazed. "Where?" Miss Marple replied from behind the Atlas cabinet's fake front. "Not in the compartment that Mr. Trent knew about, but in a second hiding place that Drake had discovered and used for his own purposes. The revelation offered closure to the awful event. As Inspector Slack prepared to arrest Trent, Miss Marple thought on the intellectual passion that had led to murder and the intricate web of lies that had engulfed what should have been a straightforward humanitarian venture. "What a shame," she mumbled as the historian was carried away. If Mr. Trent had been honest from the start, both he and Mr. Drake might still be alive today, and the documents would have been properly archived for posterity. The morning sun shone through the breakfast room windows, illuminating the serene sight that belied the drama that had just ended. Lady Bantry's benevolent bookshop would finally reopen, but it would be remembered as the site where scholarly devotion and criminal greed clashed with tragic results.